In the year 1873, in the quiet town of Willow Creek, Georgia, there stood a mansion that carried with it a curse whispered from porch to porch and tavern to tavern. It was the home of the Marlowe family, a once proud plantation that had aged into something darker, something feared. Travelers passing through were sometimes invited to spend the night, drawn in by the family's charm and the promise of shelter, but none who slept within its walls were ever seen again. The townsfolk said the house itself was alive, that it fed on the souls of those unlucky enough to cross its threshold. Some believed the Marlowes were victims themselves, trapped in eternal service to the thing that had claimed their home. Others swore they were willing accomplices, smiling hosts who lured the unsuspecting to their doom. Whatever the truth, one fact remained. Every guest who entered the Marlowe house became a name erased from history, another ghost bound to the hunger of its walls. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. In the year 1873, Willow Creek, Georgia, was a town that thrived on silence. The kind of silence that clung to its red dirt roads and pressed against the whitewashed porches of its weather-beaten homes. Travelers passing through would remark on it, that peculiar hush, as though the town itself had secrets it refused to let slip. And at the heart of those secrets stood the Marlowe plantation. The mansion loomed at the edge of town, set back behind a long stretch of oaks whose tangled branches met overhead, forming a kind of natural archway that felt less like welcome and more like warning. The house itself was vast, 3 stories of faded grandeur, its once white columns now streaked with mildew, its roof sagging where storms had pried at the shingles. Yet, despite its decay, the Marlowe place held a strange sort of dignity, as though it knew the townspeople feared it and wore that fear like a crown. No one in Willow Creek would speak openly about the house, not in daylight at least, but in hushed tones, over whiskey glasses and crackling fires, they told stories. Stories of travelers who had accepted the Marlowes' hospitality peddlers, soldiers returning from war, wandering preachers, and never been seen again. Some claimed the family themselves were to blame, cursed by some ancestral sin. Others swore the house was alive, its walls swallowing men whole. The truth was never proven. The only fact that lingered was that the road to the Marlowe plantation was one no local ever willingly traveled. At dusk, when the sun bled into the horizon and the cicadas screamed in the trees, the mansion's windows glowed faintly, as if someone had lit candles in every room. Yet no one ever saw who struck the matches. From the town's main road, a passerby might swear they caught a shadow moving behind the glass, a figure standing just beyond the curtains, but when they blinked, the figure was gone. Children dared each other to run to the front gate, a rusted iron barrier twisted and broken with age. Most never made it past the tree line. The few who did claimed they felt the ground tremble faintly beneath their feet, as though the earth itself wanted to pull them down into silence. The Marlowe name was one that carried weight in Willow Creek. Once, the family had been wealthy plantation owners, with more land than they could farm and more power than the town sheriff himself. But by 1873, their riches had dwindled, their workers gone, and their estate left to rot. Only Silas Marlowe, his wife Eugenia, and their children remained, isolated in their crumbling mansion. Yet, though their fortune had vanished, their grip on the town's imagination and its fear was stronger than ever. It was said that the Marlowes were gracious hosts, always eager to offer food, drink, and a bed to those who sought it. But to sleep under their roof was to tempt fate. For every guest who had entered through the grand doors of the Marlowe plantation, none had ever been seen to leave. The storm rolled into Willow Creek like a living beast, snarling with thunder and slashing at the land with sheets of rain. The roads turned to rivers of red mud, and the wind tore at the trees until their branches bent low and threatened to snap. On that evening, a lone figure pressed onward down the road that led to the Marlowe estate. His name was Thomas Ellery, a traveling salesman with a leather case full of trinkets, pocket watches, and fine combs. He had spent the day moving from town to town, but when the heavens opened, he had little choice but to seek shelter wherever he could find it. Thomas was a man used to uncertainty. He had slept in barns, in stables, even under the open sky, but the storm that raged above him left no chance of survival outdoors. His eyes caught the faint glow ahead, the unmistakable shimmer of lighted windows through the curtain of rain. As he trudged closer, the silhouette of the Marlowe mansion revealed itself, looming like some weary giant in the night. The long driveway, flanked by oaks, seemed to stretch on forever, and with each step his boots sank deeper into the mud. When Thomas finally reached the front doors, he raised the brass knocker, its metal chilled by the storm, and let it fall 3 times. The sound echoed through the house, hollow and commanding, before silence swallowed it again. He was about to step back when the door creaked open. Standing in the threshold was Silas Marlowe, tall and rigid, his hair streaked with gray but his eyes sharp as flint. "Good evening, sir," Silas said, his voice low, almost courteous. "You look as though the storm has tried to kill you. Come inside." Thomas offered a grateful nod and stepped into the entryway, dripping rain onto the checkered floor. The air inside was warm, scented faintly with wood smoke and something sweet, though he could not place it. The grandeur of the foyer startled him, the sweeping staircase, the oil paintings watching from the walls, the glint of a chandelier overhead. Though time had chipped away at the mansion, it still spoke of wealth and history. From deeper within the house, 2 figures appeared. Eugenia Marlowe glided forward, a woman of striking beauty despite her years, her dark gown trailing across the floor. Beside her was Margaret, their daughter, her eyes downcast as though she had been trained not to look too long at guests. A moment later, Elias emerged from the shadows, his smile too sharp, his gaze lingering a little too long on the stranger's soaked clothes. "You must stay the night," Eugenia insisted, her tone warm but leaving little room for refusal. No traveler should be left to the mercy of weather such as this. Thomas hesitated. Something in their eagerness unsettled him, yet the storm outside left him powerless to decline. He forced a smile, bowing his head politely. "If it isn't too much trouble, I would be most grateful." The Marlowes exchanged the faintest of glances, a flicker so subtle Thomas might have imagined it. Then Silas placed a firm hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the parlor. The firelight danced across the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Unnerving though their hospitality seemed, Thomas could not shake the sense that his arrival had been anticipated, as though the Marlowes had been waiting for him all along. The parlor was a grand chamber meant to impress, though its elegance carried a certain weight, as though the air itself had grown stale from too many years of silence. Heavy curtains sagged over tall windows, shutting out the storm's fury and trapping the warmth of the fire within. On the mantel, a row of silver candlesticks gleamed, their flames flickering like watchful eyes. Thomas sat stiffly in a high-backed chair while the family gathered around him, their movements deliberate, almost theatrical, as if each gesture had been carefully rehearsed. Silas Marlowe took the seat nearest the fire, his posture impossibly straight, hands resting on the armrests, like a man accustomed to command. His face was stern, his jaw square, his eyes fixed on Thomas with a gaze that seemed to weigh him, measure him, and record every detail. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had been listened to all his life, but beneath the smooth cadence of his voice, there was something sharp, as though every word had been chosen with a hidden purpose. Eugenia settled across from her husband, her gown rustling like whispers as she moved. Her beauty was of the kind that unsettled rather than comforted, features too perfect, a smile that lingered too long. She poured tea into a porcelain cup for Thomas, the liquid steaming as she handed it to him with delicate fingers. "You must warm yourself," she said, her voice soft, almost musical, yet her eyes, pale and unblinking, never left his face. Margaret sat quietly at her mother's side, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She appeared no older than 20, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, but her demeanor was that of someone much older. She did not speak, only offered Thomas a fleeting glance, her lips curved in a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw something, fear, perhaps, or pity hidden in her expression, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Elias leaned casually against the doorway, a glass of wine in his hand, his grin a shade too broad. He looked to be a few years younger than Thomas, though his eyes carried a mischief that bordered on malice. "Traveling salesman, are you?" Elias asked, his tone light. Yet Thomas felt the weight behind the words. "You must see a great deal of the world." Thomas nodded, choosing his words carefully. "Enough to know when a storm is best faced from inside four walls." The family laughed politely, each chuckle rising and fading at the same rhythm, as though they had practiced such moments for guests. Their charm was convincing, their civility precise, yet none of it felt real. Every smile seemed painted on, every word touched with a subtle falseness, like actors repeating lines from a play long memorized. As the fire crackled, Thomas could not shake the growing unease that settled in his chest. He felt less like a welcomed guest, and more like a subject under examination, as though the Marlowes were studying him, testing him, waiting for something unseen to unfold. The storm had not eased when Eugenia Marlowe suggested they move to the dining room. Her words carried the gentle insistence of a command, and though Thomas felt weary from his travels, he rose without protest. Silas led the way, his tall frame casting long shadows against the corridor's walls. Oil lamps flickered as they passed, revealing more of the house's faded grandeur, ornate wainscoting, portraits cloaked in dust, and mirrors so tarnished they reflected little more than ghostly shapes. The dining room itself was cavernous, a chamber meant for banquets and gatherings of dozens, though only a single polished table stretched down its center. Upon it lay a feast that seemed impossible given the state of the crumbling estate: roasted pheasant, glazed carrots, steaming bread, bowls of figs and blackberries that gleamed like jewels under the candlelight. The scents rose in a tempting wave, rich and savory, the kind of aroma that made a man's stomach remember just how long it had been since he'd last eaten a proper meal. Eugenia gestured gracefully to a chair at the table's head, a place of honor, and Thomas hesitated before sitting. Silas took the opposite end, while Eugenia and Margaret sat to his right, Elias to his left. Their positions were deliberate, as though no seat had been chosen at random. Before Thomas could lift a hand toward the bread, Silas raised a glass of wine and spoke. "It is our custom," he said smoothly, "that all who find shelter in our home break bread with us. It is the way of the Marlowes' hospitality above all." They all drank, and Thomas followed suit, though he noticed their eyes never left him. He tried the bread first, its crust warm and soft, the taste almost heavenly after a day of travel. He sampled the pheasant next, the meat tender and seasoned with care. Everything was exquisite, a meal finer than any inn could have offered, yet with every bite he felt their gaze upon him. Margaret's eyes lingered longest, her hands folded neatly, untouched plate before her. Elias smirked into his wine, occasionally remarking on Thomas's appetite as though amused. Eugenia smiled throughout, her expression soft but fixed, like porcelain. And Silas watched most intently of all, his stare steady, unblinking, as though measuring each motion of fork to mouth. Thomas tried to make conversation, commenting on the food, the storm, the roads leading into town, but the replies were brief, spoken with perfect politeness, yet stripped of any warmth. It became clear the ritual of dining together mattered more than idle words. The family seemed to savor not the food, but the act of watching him consume it. The fire in the hearth snapped loudly, startling Thomas for a moment. In that pause, he realized none of the Marlowes had eaten more than a token bite. Their plates remained full, their glasses hardly touched, as though their hunger was satisfied not by the feast laid before them, but by something else entirely. By the time the meal ended, Thomas's hunger was gone, replaced by unease. The richness of the food sat heavy in his stomach, but heavier still was the sense that he had been part of something far more calculated than simple hospitality. The air in the dining room grew heavy after the meal, as though the silence itself pressed against Thomas's ears. When Silas finally rose from his seat, the family followed in quiet unison. Thomas expected to be shown to a guest room, yet instead he was led through a long corridor lined with closed doors and faded tapestries. The storm outside still battered the windows, and each clap of thunder seemed to rattle the very bones of the house. It was in this dim passage that Thomas first noticed her. A girl, no older than 16, dressed in a plain servant's frock, appeared at the far end of the hallway. She moved with the practiced quiet of someone accustomed to being unseen. When Eugenia turned briefly to speak to her husband, the girl darted forward and brushed past Thomas. In the swiftest motion, she pressed a small, crumpled scrap of paper into his hand. Her eyes met his only for a breath wide, frightened, glistening with a kind of urgency words could never capture. Before Thomas could react, she slipped into a side door and vanished, her presence swallowed by the shadows. He stopped in his tracks, fingers tightening around the note, but when he glanced back at the family, none seemed to have noticed. Elias smirked faintly, though Thomas could not tell if the expression was meant for him or if it was simply the boy's natural demeanor. When they reached the guest chamber prepared for him, Thomas excused himself quickly. The room was modest compared to the grandeur he had seen elsewhere, but the bed was wide and layered with heavy quilts. As the door closed behind him, he drew the paper from his pocket. The message was scrawled hastily, the ink uneven, as if written in desperation. "Do not eat again, do not sleep. The house is listening." His heart lurched. The words carried no explanation, only dread. He turned the paper over, but it was blank. Who was the girl? And why risk such a warning? Thomas pressed the note to the candlelight until the edges curled with heat, then tucked it inside his case. He sat at the edge of the bed. The echo of the servant's eyes burned into his memory. Every instinct told him to leave at once, yet the storm outside was unrelenting. Even if he dared, the road would be impassable. From beyond the walls came the faintest sound like footsteps, but too light, too measured, as though someone moved with care not to be heard. Thomas leaned toward the door, listening. The noise ceased, leaving him with nothing but the howling wind and the oppressive stillness of the Marlowe house. He realized then that he was not simply a guest. He was being watched, tested, and perhaps already trapped. Sleep refused to come. The note from the servant girl throbbed in Thomas's mind like a wound that would not close. He lay awake listening to the restless groans of the old mansion, each creak and sigh sounding less like the shifting of timber and more like whispers crawling through the walls. At last, unable to bear the stillness, he rose from the bed and lit the small lamp provided on the bedside table. Its glow was faint, but enough to guide him through the unfamiliar corridors. The house stretched on like a maze, every hallway longer than he expected, every stairwell winding as though leading him in circles. Portraits of long-dead Marlowes stared down from the walls, their painted expressions sharp and suspicious, as if offended by his intrusion. He moved cautiously, listening for the voices of his hosts, but the mansion seemed empty, occupied only by shadows. It was during this wandering that he found it the east wing. The corridor leading there ended abruptly in a set of double doors, tall and imposing, their wood darker than the rest of the house. Heavy iron locks fastened them shut, bolts as thick as his wrist securing the frame. Across the panels ran crooked lines of nails, hammered deep, sealing the cracks as though to keep something inside. Dust thickened the air, and cobwebs hung like curtains over the handles. The wing had not been touched in years. Thomas lifted a hand, resting his fingers against the cold iron. He thought he heard something stir on the other side, soft, dragging, a sound too faint to be certain. His pulse quickened. Why would a family so proud of their home allow an entire section to rot, closed off like a prison? He resolved to ask, though every instinct told him silence was wiser. That opportunity came the next morning, when Silas Marlowe appeared in the parlor, his presence filling the room like a shadow stretching at dawn. Thomas, feigning casual curiosity, gestured toward the far corridor. "I could not help but notice a wing of the house sealed shut. Do you keep it closed for repairs?" Silas's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest moment, something sharp flickered across his expression. But then his lips curved into a slow, practiced smile. "Ah," he said smoothly. "The East Wing. A place full of old memories, Mr. Ellery. Best left undisturbed." Thomas pressed no further, though the answer gnawed at him. The smile on Silas's face lingered too long, too knowing. It was not the smile of a man recalling fond memories. It was the smile of someone guarding a secret. And Thomas realized, with a weight that settled deep in his chest, that the locks on the east wing were not to keep intruders out. They were to keep something else in. The storm had passed by morning, though the house seemed unchanged, wrapped in its own unyielding gloom. Sunlight tried to force its way through the curtains, but even the daylight here felt muted, as though dimmed by the very walls. Thomas rose from the bed, his body heavy with restless hours spent listening to the sighs and murmurs that drifted through the night. He could not decide if those sounds had been born from his imagination, or if the Marlowe house truly had a voice of its own. As he went to dress, his foot caught on a loose board beneath the bed frame. It shifted with a groan, and when he bent to examine it, he noticed a hollow space between the floor and the frame. Reaching into the dust, his fingers brushed against worn leather. He drew out a small, tattered book, its cover cracked and stiff with age. The brass clasp that once bound it had broken, and when he opened it, the yellowed pages gave off the faint scent of mildew. The handwriting inside was hurried, uneven, the words bleeding into one another as though written in the dark. The entries belonged to someone who had once stayed in the very room he occupied. The writer described his journey another traveler, a preacher by the look of his language, who had accepted the Marlowes' hospitality. At first his notes carried warmth, gratitude for the fine meals and comfortable lodgings. But as the days went on, his tone shifted. "The family is too kind," one entry read. "Their smiles are rehearsed, their eyes too sharp. I cannot tell if I am their guest or their prisoner." A later passage chilled Thomas further. "There are sounds in the walls, low cries at first, then screams muffled as if swallowed by the house itself. I asked Eugenia, but she only smiled and told me the wind sometimes plays tricks in old homes." The writing grew erratic, letters slanting as if written with a shaking hand. One page had been torn almost entirely through by the pressure of the pen. "I fear the walls are not hollow wood but something alive. Last night I heard a voice call my name from the darkness." The final entry stopped mid-sentence. "If I do not leave by morning, I fear I—" The ink dragged across the page into a jagged line. Then nothing. No signature, no closure. Just silence. Thomas closed the diary, his throat dry. His pulse pounded in his ears, and for a long moment he could not move. The house creaked around him, and he thought he heard faint, deep in the walls, a sound too close to a human moan to be dismissed. Whatever fate had befallen the preacher, Thomas felt it pressing at the edges of his own future. And with the diary clenched in his hands, he realized he might already be following the same path. The diary weighed heavy in Thomas's coat pocket as he stepped into the hall that evening. He had no intention of sleeping, not after what he had read. Instead, he wandered the corridors, telling himself he sought fresh air, or perhaps a glass of water, though in truth he simply needed to move, to shake the growing dread that pressed against his chest. The house seemed endless at night. Corridors stretched further than they had in daylight, each corner opening into another passage, another stairwell. The flickering oil lamps threw shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls, creating shapes that seemed to move just beyond the corner of his vision. But it was not the shadows that unnerved him most. It was the portraits. Every hallway in the Marlowe estate was lined with them, great frames of gilded wood, canvases so large they nearly reached the floor. Each painting bore the likeness of some Marlowe ancestor: stern-faced men in stiff collars, pale women draped in black silk, children posed with lifeless dolls. Their features were sharp, their eyes dark, painted with a precision that gave them uncanny realism. As Thomas walked, he felt them watching. At first it was only a trick of the light, or so he told himself, the flames reflecting oddly across the varnish. But the longer he lingered, the more certain he became that their gazes followed him. If he paused, their eyes seemed fixed directly upon him. If he moved, their stares shifted, tracking his every step down the hall. He stopped before one in particular, a man who bore a striking resemblance to Silas, though the paint had begun to crack across his face. The figure's lips were pressed into a thin line, his gaze hard and unyielding. Thomas leaned closer, studying the fine strokes of the brush, until his own reflection blurred with the painted features. For a moment, he swore the eyes blinked. A sudden noise, soft, deliberate footsteps echoed behind him. He spun, but the corridor was empty. Only the portraits stared back. His breath quickened, and he forced himself to continue, his boots clicking against the wooden floorboards that groaned beneath his weight. At the turn of another hallway, the sensation grew unbearable. The painted children seemed to smirk faintly, their mouths curving in ways he had not noticed before. One portrait of a woman in mourning appeared to tilt her head ever so slightly, as if regarding him with quiet amusement. By the time he reached the end of the corridor, Thomas's skin was clammy, his nerves frayed. He turned once more to glance back, and in the wavering glow of the lamps, the eyes of dozens of Marlowes bore into him, a silent congregation of the dead. He hurried away, but the certainty remained. The portraits were not merely paintings, they were witnesses. And in the stillness of the house, he could not shake the feeling that they were waiting for him to falter. The morning air in Willow Creek carried the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, a welcome contrast to the suffocating stillness of the Marlowe estate. Thomas left under the pretense of fetching supplies, though in truth he needed distance from the house and its watchful eyes. He walked briskly into town, the diary tucked securely inside his coat, the memory of the portraits still gnawing at his thoughts. The town was small, little more than a cluster of weathered buildings gathered around a crossroads. He found the inn on the corner, its wooden sign swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of roasted coffee and tobacco smoke. Behind the counter stood the innkeeper, an older man with a lined face and wary eyes that seemed to measure strangers before offering them welcome. Thomas approached, ordered a coffee, and after a moment of polite conversation, steered the subject toward the Marlowe family. "They've been kind enough to give me a bed while I pass through," he said carefully, watching the innkeeper's reaction. The man's face tightened at once. He leaned back, folding his arms. "The Marlowes," he repeated, his voice low. "Not many speak of them these days." Thomas pressed gently, feigning ignorance. "I was surprised by their hospitality. I'd heard little about the family before." The innkeeper's eyes flicked toward the door, as though to be sure no one else was listening. "Folks don't say much, but I'll tell you this ain't wise to stay there. Too many who have." "Too many?" Thomas prompted, his throat dry. The man nodded grimly. "Travelers, drifters, salesmen, even a preacher once. All stopped at the Marlowe place. Not a one seen again after. Folks used to ask questions, but they stopped. Either they didn't want to know, or the answers were too close for comfort." Thomas felt the diary's weight against his chest. "So every guest vanished?" "Every one," the innkeeper said. His eyes hard now, fixed on Thomas. "House swallows them whole. People whisper, call it cursed. But no sheriff, no judge, no preacher ever did a thing. The Marlowes are old blood here. Their roots go deeper than law." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of a spoon against a cup. The innkeeper leaned closer, his voice dropping. "If you're smart, son, you'll pack your bag and leave tonight. Don't look back. That house is no place for the living." Thomas managed a nod, but dread coiled in his stomach. He had seen too much already: the diary, the sealed wing, the watching portraits. He knew leaving might not be as simple as stepping through the door. The Marlowe family had welcomed him too warmly, as though they had been waiting for him all along. The afternoon sun bled through a veil of gray clouds, casting the Marlowe grounds in a pallid light. Thomas, still rattled by the innkeeper's words, found himself restless, pacing the halls until the sound of soft footsteps drew his attention. Peering through a window, he caught sight of Eugenia Marlowe drifting toward the back of the house, her figure swathed in black silk despite the humid air. She moved with the elegance of a woman half her age, her posture erect, her steps deliberate. Curiosity gnawed at him, and against his better judgment, he followed. The garden lay hidden behind a tall lattice of ivy-covered stone, the iron gate nearly swallowed by vines. Eugenia pushed it open with ease, and Thomas, keeping his distance, slipped in after the gate had swung closed. The air was heavy with the scent of wild jasmine and damp earth. At first glance, the garden was a place of beauty, rose bushes sprawling in wild tangles, lilies bowing beneath their own weight, and vines creeping across cracked marble statues. But as Thomas ventured further, the charm soured. Half buried beneath weeds and thorny brambles were stones flat, weather-worn, some leaning as though pushed from beneath. They were gravestones. Their inscriptions were nearly erased, the names and dates dissolved by time, leaving only faint scratches to mark what had once been written. He crouched before one, brushing moss away with the back of his hand, but the letters refused to yield themselves. Each stone was anonymous, a record of lives lost, but not remembered. Eugenia stood at the far end of the garden, her back to him. She knelt beside a crumbling statue of an angel, placing fresh lilies at its base with a reverence that chilled him. Her lips moved soundlessly, as though whispering to someone unseen. For a moment, Thomas feared she had noticed him, but she did not turn. She lingered there, her pale fingers stroking the stone wings as though soothing a child. The longer he looked, the more gravestones he saw rows upon rows, some overtaken by roots, others broken in half, their fragments sinking into the soil. There were far too many for one family estate. These were not ancestral markers of the Marlowe line. No, these were unclaimed graves, stripped of identity, hidden in the overgrowth like secrets buried deep. Thomas's chest tightened. He thought of the diary, the preacher's unfinished words, the innkeeper's warnings. The garden was not a sanctuary. A graveyard for those who had come before him, guests who had entered the Marlowe house and never left. Eugenia rose, her head tilting slightly, as though she sensed another presence nearby. Thomas froze in the shadows, heart pounding. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her gaze toward the thicket where he stood. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, one that held no surprise, only recognition. It was then Thomas knew. The Marlowes were well aware of the garden's secret because they had planted it themselves. The night pressed heavily upon the Marlowe house, the storm clouds returning to drape the sky in black velvet. Rain tapped softly against the glass panes of Thomas's window, a steady rhythm that should have been lulling, but instead only heightened his unease. He had returned from the garden with his mind in turmoil, the images of gravestones hidden in tangled weeds clinging to him like a fever. He tried to sleep, though his body refused rest. The bed was soft, the quilt heavy, yet he lay awake, staring into the dark, the diary open on the nightstand beside him. At first it was only the usual groans of the house, the creak of old beams, the sigh of settling wood. But then another sound emerged, a dragging noise, faint but deliberate, rising from behind the walls. Thomas sat up, holding his breath. The sound came again, a slow scrape, as though something heavy was being pulled along the floorboards, but muffled by the thickness of the wall. He pressed his ear to the plaster, his skin prickling with cold. There it was, closer now, like bare feet shuffling, like nails clawing softly at wood. A whisper followed, so faint he could not be sure it was real. It was not words, but the hushed exhale of someone breathing, inches away, just beyond the wall. He staggered back, his lamp flickering in his trembling hand, the shadows leaping madly across the room. The dragging grew louder, traveling along the length of the wall as though whatever was inside was pacing. He followed it with wide eyes, his heart hammering, until it reached the corner and stopped. Silence fell, oppressive and complete. Then, with a sudden jolt, the wall shuddered as if struck from within. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. Thomas clutched the lamp tighter, his throat dry. He whispered to himself that it was rats, the house settling, some trick of acoustics. Yet the weight of the sound, the deliberate rhythm of it, betrayed that lie. These were not the noises of vermin. These were movements human, or close enough to it. His gaze darted to the locked east wing, the memory of its bolted doors rushing back. Was this what they kept sealed away? Not memories, as Silas had claimed, but something alive, something trapped, scratching at the walls, begging to be let out. The silence stretched until Thomas thought he had imagined it all. He lowered the lamp, trying to steady his breath. Then, from directly behind the headboard, came a single, sharp knock. He nearly cried out, his hand clamping over his mouth. The knock echoed once, then was gone, leaving only the rain outside and the crushing certainty that he was not alone in the room. Breakfast was served with unusual grandeur the following morning. The dining table gleamed with polished silver, crystal goblets catching the pale light that filtered through lace curtains. Platters of steaming eggs, roasted ham, and buttered rolls filled the air with a comforting aroma, yet Thomas found no comfort in the feast. His hands shook faintly as he reached for his cup, the memory of dragging sounds in his walls keeping his stomach knotted tight. The Marlowes, however, were in rare spirits. Silas presided at the head of the table, his towering frame and booming laugh filling the room as though nothing sinister lingered beyond their walls. Eugenia sat opposite him, serene as a statue, her pale hands folded neatly around a cup of tea she never sipped. Margaret and Elias shared private smiles, whispering as if in on some joke too dark for their guest to understand. "Mr. Ellery," Silas began, his deep voice rolling across the table like a sermon. "You've settled into our home so naturally. It is as though you've been here far longer than a single night." Thomas forced a polite smile. "Your hospitality has been memorable," he said, careful with his words. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes bright, her voice sing-song. "Perhaps you needn't rush away. Many who visit us stay longer than they planned." "Yes," Elias added, his fork tapping idly against his plate. "Some stay forever." The words were delivered with a laugh, but the sound rang hollow, carrying no warmth. Thomas glanced at Eugenia, hoping to find some maternal softness that might counter their eerie remarks. Instead, she held his gaze, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. Silas spread his hands as though presenting a gift. "You see, Mr. Ellery, the world outside is full of hardship and loneliness. Here, beneath this roof, one finds belonging. Surely that is worth more than endless roads and empty inns." Thomas felt the walls pressing in around him, every portrait watching, every locked door whispering that he was already trapped. He tried to laugh lightly, to brush off their words. "A fine offer indeed, but I fear I'm a restless sort. The road calls to me." Eugenia's eyes sharpened, a glint like steel catching the light. "The road does not always lead where one wishes to go," she said softly. "Sometimes it leads here, and when it does, it is because it was meant to." For a moment the family sat in silence, all eyes fixed upon him, their smiles poised yet unyielding. Thomas shifted in his chair, the weight of their stares making him feel less like a guest and more like prey seated at a hunter's table. The meal continued, but its flavor turned to ash in his mouth. For the first time, Thomas understood what the innkeeper meant. The Marlowes did not offer shelter, they offered possession, and from the look in their eyes, they had already decided he belonged to them. The house had grown restless as the day waned, or perhaps it was Thomas's nerves fraying at last. Every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate, every whisper of wind against the shutters like a sigh from some hidden mouth. He kept to the hallways, avoiding the family whenever possible, but Margaret found him all the same. She appeared at the end of a dim corridor, her white dress trailing like smoke. Her footsteps so soft he hadn't heard her approach. "Mr. Ellery," she said gently, her tone strangely tender. "You wander the halls as though searching for something." Thomas swallowed hard, trying to mask his unease. "A habit of mine. I cannot sit still for long." Margaret tilted her head, studying him with eyes too sharp for her youthful face. Then, in a sudden fluid motion, she stepped closer, blocking his path. "You won't find a way out," she whispered. Her words trembled with urgency, though her smile remained fixed in place. Thomas's heart kicked in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously, lowering his voice. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "The house," she said. The words nearly choked. "It lives. It breathes. It feeds." Her gaze flicked up and down the hallway, as though the walls themselves were listening. "Every guest who sleeps here, every soul that crosses its threshold, the house takes them, piece by piece." Thomas stepped back, the blood draining from his face. "That's madness," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. Margaret's eyes glistened. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I haven't tried to leave?" Her voice cracked, but her smile remained, forced and trembling. "I've run to the gates, pounded the doors, screamed until my throat bled. But the house—" She pressed a hand flat against the wall, her fingers splayed as though feeling for a pulse. "It keeps us here. We are part of it now." "My family, me, and soon, you. My family river and many dot, what's bass, we can to our. And look the many dot, to comment in clues, what's bass." Thomas's breath caught. The dragging noises in the walls, the locked east wing, the unmarked graves in the garden, all of it coiled together into a sickening truth. "Why tell me this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Her smile faltered then, the mask slipping to reveal something raw in her expression. "Because I remember what it was to be free," she whispered. "Because I don't want to watch the house consume another, but I cannot stop it. None of us can." She turned abruptly, her composure snapping back into place, her smile once more perfect and unyielding. "Dinner will be served soon," she said brightly, her tone as rehearsed as her family's. And with that, she glided down the hall, leaving Thomas trembling in the silence, the walls pressing closer around him, as though they had overheard every word. Sleep was impossible after Margaret's whispered confession. Thomas drifted through the house that night like a restless spirit, lamp in hand, his every step careful against the creaking boards. The corridors seemed to shift as if guiding him, or perhaps warning him away. Either way, the silence was too heavy to bear, and he pressed on until his searching eyes caught something peculiar, a draught curling from beneath a tapestry at the end of a narrow hall. He pulled the tapestry aside and found a seam in the wall, an outline of a door barely visible in the lamplight. His fingers traced along the edges until he found a latch. It gave with a reluctant groan, revealing a steep staircase spiraling down into blackness. The air that rose to meet him was damp and sour, carrying the stench of mold and something older, something that clung to decay. He descended slowly, each step hollow beneath his boots, the lamp flame guttering in the stale air. The staircase ended in a vaulted stone chamber, its walls slick with moisture. The sight that greeted him turned his stomach to ice. Bones. Piles of them stacked high against the walls, skulls with jaws agape, ribs collapsed into dust, femurs tangled like firewood. Scattered among them were relics of lives once lived, rusted watches, torn shoes, wedding rings that glinted faintly in the lamplight. Rotten suitcases slumped in corners, their leather eaten away by time, still faintly bearing initials too faded to read. Dresses and coats hung in tatters across the stones, moth-eaten remnants of those who had come before. Thomas staggered forward, the reek of old death clawing at his throat. His eyes fixed on a child's doll half buried beneath a collapsed skull, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes unblinking. He knelt, picking up a suitcase that crumbled in his grasp, spilling yellowed letters across the floor. Names were signed in hurried ink, strangers who had vanished without a trace. He realized then that the garden was not the first graveyard, it was only the surface. This was the house's true belly, its hoard of offerings. Every traveler, every guest, swallowed whole and stored here, as though the mansion itself collected their remnants like trophies. A sound echoed through the chamber, a slow drip of water, or perhaps footsteps, too faint to be sure. Thomas froze, his lamp trembling in his grip. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of all those lost souls. And for the first time since arriving, he understood with piercing clarity. The Marlowes had not lied when they hinted at him becoming part of the family. In this place, beneath this cursed house, the family meant only one thing: joining the countless dead who had been claimed before him. Thomas stumbled back into the upper halls with the weight of the chamber pressing against his chest, his breath shallow as though the stench of those bones had followed him upward. Every creak of the boards beneath his boots felt like the house breathing beneath him, inhaling, exhaling, waiting. He could not shake the vision of skulls stacked in silent rows, of jewelry glinting like the eyes of carrion birds. And yet, even as horror twisted through him, something deeper began to take shape, a realization that clawed at the edges of his reason. The Marlowes were guilty, but not in the way he first believed. Silas, Eugenia, Margaret, Elias. They were not hunters dragging men into the night, nor ghouls lurking with knives in hand. No. Their evil was quieter, more insidious. They did not kill in the traditional sense. They tended. They managed. They fed the thing that wore their home as flesh and bone. The memory of Margaret's whispered confession replayed in his ears. The house lives. It breathes. It feeds. He understood now. The house was no passive place, no cursed foundation of stone and timber. It was alive, hungry. And the Marlowes were its caretakers, bound to its will. They did not lure travelers out of cruelty alone, but out of necessity, their survival entwined with the mansion's hunger. Thomas thought of Eugenia laying flowers in the overgrown garden, her lips murmuring as though soothing unseen children. She was not mourning the lost, but offering tribute. Silas's measured smile, Elias's mocking tone, Margaret's brittle confession, they were all threads of the same tapestry. They had long since ceased to fight the house. Instead, they served it, ensuring its hunger never went unsated. It explained the unmarked gravestones, the bolted east wing, the dragging sounds behind the walls. The victims were not just killed. They were consumed, absorbed, perhaps even trapped in some liminal state within the structure itself. The walls were hollow because they carried more than wood and plaster. They carried voices, screams, remnants of souls swallowed whole. Thomas pressed his palms against the wallpaper, half expecting to feel it pulse beneath his touch. The silence that answered was worse than any sound. He felt watched, not by portraits or people this time, but by the house itself, every timber and nail alert to his presence. The Marlowes were not his hosts. They were keepers of a vast, unholy beast that wore the guise of a home. And Thomas, with every passing moment, felt the weight of inevitability settle over him. The house had marked him, claimed him the moment he stepped across its threshold. And the Marlowes, smiling, gracious, ever patient, were only waiting for the walls to finish their feast. The dining room glowed with the warmth of candlelight, yet the air was colder than stone. Thomas sat stiffly at the long mahogany table, his untouched plate steaming before him. Across from him, the Marlowe family seemed utterly at ease, as if the night were no different from any other. Silas carved a roast with deliberate grace, the silver knife gleaming under the light, his expression calm, almost paternal. But Thomas felt the weight of something unsaid hanging in the air, thick as smoke. Finally, Silas set the knife down and folded his hands before him, his dark eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that brooked no evasion. "Mr. Ellery," he began, his voice deep and measured, "you've come to see much of our home in a short span. More, perhaps, than most." His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "And I suspect you've come to certain conclusions." Thomas said nothing, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Silas continued, unbothered by the silence. "You believe us monsters, murderers. But you misunderstand. We are not executioners. We are stewards. Eugenia's pale fingers brushed the rim of her glass, her voice soft as velvet. The house is older than us, older than any Marlowe. We are bound to it, as vines are bound to stone. It provides, it protects, and in return, it requires. Elias leaned forward, his youthful grin sharp as a blade. And it requires you, traveler. It has already marked you. You've felt it, haven't you? In the walls, in your dreams, the house has chosen you. A cold shiver ran through Thomas, his mind flashing to the dragging sounds in his walls, the knock against his bed, the suffocating sense of being watched. He forced his voice to steady. If what you say is true, then you are all prisoners as well. You serve this thing because you must. Silas's smile widened. Precisely. Which brings us to your choice. He leaned forward, his presence filling the room like a tide. You may surrender to the house willingly. To give yourself freely is to become part of something eternal, absorbed gently, without struggle. Or, his tone darkened, his words dropping like stones. You may resist, and the house will take you violently. It will tear you apart from the inside out, piece by piece, until nothing remains but screams in the walls. Margaret's eyes flickered, and for a fleeting instant Thomas saw the shadow of pity. She looked quickly away, her hands folding tightly in her lap. Thomas's breath came shallow. And if I refuse both? He asked, though his voice cracked. Eugenia tilted her head, her smile sorrowful. There is no refusing. The house has already decided. Silas stood, towering, his hands resting firmly on the table as if delivering a final sermon. Consider well, Mr. Ellery. A gentle end, or a violent one. The only mercy left to you is in the choosing. The candles flickered, and the house seemed to groan in agreement, its timbers sighing with hunger. Thomas felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his skin, the walls tightening like jaws. His choice was no choice at all, only the manner of his devouring. And as Silas's shadow loomed over him, Thomas realized that bargaining with the Marlowes was nothing more than bargaining with the maw of the house itself. The moment the heavy door slammed shut behind him, Thomas knew he had been led into a trap. The echo of the iron bolt sliding into place reverberated through the chamber, final and absolute. He pressed his shoulder against the door, straining, but it did not budge. The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was a waiting kind of stillness, like the hush before a predator strikes. The room itself was small, bare of furniture, the plaster walls stained with patches of damp. At first, it seemed only a neglected chamber, but then Thomas noticed the rhythm. A faint swell beneath his boots, the whisper of air shifting against his ears. The walls trembled almost imperceptibly, like muscle beneath flesh. He froze, his chest tight, listening. The movement came again, a long, drawn-out contraction followed by release. The walls were breathing. His stomach lurched. He stumbled backward, pressing against the farthest corner, eyes darting across every surface. The plaster bulged slightly, pushing inward before retreating, pulsing with an uncanny cadence that matched no heartbeat, no living thing he had ever known. A sick realization spread through him. This was no room built by men. This was the house itself, alive and aware, closing its jaws. He thought of the missing travelers, of the journal beneath his bed with its last unfinished entry. He understood now why no bodies were ever found. The house had consumed them, not with teeth, but with walls that closed like a throat. God help me, he whispered, the sound snatched away as if swallowed by the air. The floor shifted beneath him, rising slightly, urging him closer to the center. He fought the sensation, bracing against the corner, but already the walls had crept closer, narrowing the space. A low groan rolled through the plaster, a sound almost like satisfaction. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he clawed at the door, his nails splintering against the wood. Something brushed his cheek, a faint ripple, like the graze of unseen fingers. He spun, but there was nothing except the wall, bulging outward before retracting again. The room was alive in every direction, and it meant to squeeze him into nothing. Thomas's mind reeled, but desperation lent him clarity. If the Marlowes were caretakers, if they had lived within these walls for years, there must be a way to survive its hunger, at least temporarily. He searched the chamber frantically, running his hands along every seam, every crack. His palm struck something cold iron embedded in the plaster, like a hinge or a forgotten latch. He dug at it with broken nails until they bled, the walls inching closer with each frantic movement. The air thickened, pressing into his lungs, each breath a labor. The walls were no longer just moving, they were closing, the space shrinking by inches. He imagined the final moment, when bone would snap and flesh would burst, his body absorbed into the marrow of the house like the others. But the latch gave way under his grip, the plaster crumbling, and a thin crack of darkness appeared. Without hesitation, he forced his body through, scraping his shoulders raw as he shoved himself into the narrow passage beyond. Behind him, the room groaned, the walls slamming shut with a sickening thud, as though disappointed at losing its prey. Panting in the dark corridor, Thomas realized he had seen the true fate of every guest before him. The house had not just killed them, it had digested them, and now it wanted him. He pressed on into the blackness, the pulse of the house still thrumming around him, the echoes of the quiet room following like a promise that it would not give up so easily. Thomas stumbled through the narrow crawl space, his palms torn raw and his breath ragged. The groan of the quiet room still echoed in his ears, as if the house itself had sighed at losing its meal. The corridor was little more than a vein within the mansion, pulsing faintly beneath his fingertips. He had no sense of direction, only the desperate instinct to keep moving before the walls decided to close in again. A faint glow appeared ahead, a lantern's light, soft and wavering. His heart thudded with hope, though he suspected it was yet another trick. He pressed forward until he saw her. Margaret, standing in a shallow alcove, the lantern's flame painting her pale face in gold. Her dark eyes glimmered with something between relief and guilt. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low, urgent. "The house wanted you to die in that room." Thomas leaned against the wall, his body trembling. "Then why open it? Why show me a way out?" She stepped closer, her fingers tightening around the lantern handle. For a moment, she looked like a frightened child rather than the polished daughter at the Marlowe table. But her words betrayed something darker. "Because it asked me to. And when the house asks, we obey." The fragile thread of trust Thomas had clung to snapped. He drew back, his eyes narrowing. "So this isn't mercy. This is obedience." Margaret lowered her gaze, ashamed. "It isn't that simple. You think us prisoners, and you're right, but you don't yet understand the cost of disobedience. The house doesn't simply feed, it keeps. It chooses who remains, who serves, who suffers, and now." She hesitated, her lips trembling as if forcing the words out. "Now it wants a new keeper." The air thickened between them, and Thomas felt the cold dread settle in his gut. "Keeper," he repeated. The word, bitter. "You mean me?" Margaret nodded, her face drawn tight with sorrow. "My family has served long enough. We are bound, but even chains can weaken with time. The house demands fresh blood to hold its walls, to bear its hunger. I begged it not to choose you, but it does not listen." Thomas felt the weight of her gaze, the quiet plea hidden in it. He saw then what he had not allowed himself to before. The Marlowes were not merely accomplices but captives, their survival purchased at the cost of others. Yet her betrayal stung all the same. She had freed him from one death, only to deliver him to another. "Why tell me this?" he asked, his voice cracking under the strain. "Because you must understand," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If you fight it, the house will tear you apart. But if you yield, if you accept the role, it will keep you. As it has kept us. That is the only way to survive." Thomas staggered back, rage and despair battling within him. Survive? That isn't survival, it's damnation. Margaret reached for him, but he pulled away, her hand hovering in the air between them. You don't see it now, she whispered, almost desperately. But the house always gets what it wants. Always. The lantern flame flickered, casting their shadows against the breathing walls. And in that wavering light, Thomas realized he was no longer merely a guest, fighting to escape. He was prey groomed for inheritance, chosen not just to be consumed, but to belong. And Margaret, with her soft sorrow and trembling words, had been the one to guide him into the jaws of his fate. The hidden stair groaned beneath Thomas's boots as he descended once more into the belly of the house. The lantern he carried sputtered, its light shuddering across the damp stone walls. The chamber below waited like an open maw, filled with the remains of countless guests, bones piled in grotesque heaps, tattered clothing, rusting jewelry, and leather suitcases rotting where their owners had abandoned them. It smelled of earth and iron, but beneath that, Thomas could swear he detected the sour reek of breath, as though the room itself exhaled. He clutched the flask of lamp oil he had stolen from the upstairs kitchen. His hands shook, but his resolve was steel. Margaret's words gnawed at him. The house always gets what it wants. But he refused to be claimed, refused to be swallowed into its hollow lungs. If the house was alive, then it could die. He splashed oil across the chamber floor, over the bones and the warped beams that jutted from the earth like ribs. The liquid spread in dark streams, soaking the filth. The house groaned above him, a long, low sound that rumbled through the walls. It felt like protest. He struck the match. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, staring at the tiny flame wavering at the tip, wondering if this would be salvation or damnation. Then he dropped it. The chamber ignited in an instant. Flames leapt to the ceiling, dancing across beams, licking hungrily at the oil-soaked bones. The roar of the fire drowned out his pounding heart. Heat struck him in waves, searing his skin, filling the air with a choking haze. He staggered back, shielding his face, but through the crackling blaze, something monstrous stirred. The walls pulsed harder now, contracting and expanding with frantic rhythm, as though the house were breathing faster. The floor trembled beneath his boots. Instead of recoiling, the fire spread deeper, threading through cracks in the stone as if the house itself were drinking it in. Thomas stared, horror dawning. The flames weren't destroying it, they were feeding it. A scream erupted, not from any human throat but from the walls themselves. A chorus of wails echoed through the chamber, the sound of every lost guest, every soul claimed by the house. The fire seemed to quicken the voices, each flame birthing another howl. Smoke curled upward, but instead of blackening the beams, it was drawn into them, absorbed into the walls like sustenance. Thomas stumbled back up the staircase, but the fire followed, not chasing, but carried by the house itself. Flames crawled along the walls, slithering like serpents. Yet the wood did not char, nor the plaster crumble. The fire became part of it, glowing through the walls as veins of molten light. By the time he reached the upper hall, the house was alive with a fiery glow. Portraits on the walls warped, their painted eyes blazing, mouths twisting into shapes of silent laughter. The floors swelled beneath him, hot and trembling, each step like walking across the belly of some burning beast. He collapsed against the railing, sweat pouring down his face, lungs clawing for air. He had tried to kill it, but in his desperation, he had only made it stronger. The house no longer merely breathed, it roared, each wall exhaling waves of firelight, each groan vibrating like a hymn of triumph. And in that infernal glow, Thomas understood the depth of his mistake. He had not wounded the Marlowe House. He had awakened it. Dawn broke over Willow Creek with a sky the color of ash, the light weak and trembling as though reluctant to touch the Marlowe plantation. The house stood unscathed, its weathered columns streaked with dew, its windows glinting faintly in the morning Sunday. No scorch marks marred the walls, no smoke curled from its roof. It was as though the fire Thomas had unleashed in the night had never been. The only proof of it lingered deep within the timbers, where the glow of smoldering veins pulsed faintly, hidden from the eyes of the world. Inside, the Marlowes gathered at the long mahogany table, their composure impeccable as always. Silas carved into the morning bread with quiet precision, his expression unreadable. Eugenia poured tea, her delicate hands steady, the steam curling like smoke from a candle snuffed too soon. Margaret sat with her gaze lowered, her lips pressed tight, as if holding back words she could never speak. Elias toyed with a silver spoon, his grin faint but sharp, like a child savoring a secret. The chair at the far end of the table remained empty. No trace of Thomas Ellery lingered, no suitcase in the hall, no boots by the door. His room was bare, the bed neatly made, as though he had never slept there at all. The house had swallowed him whole, leaving not even a whisper of his struggle. By mid-morning, the sound of wagon wheels creaked along the dirt road. A stranger approached, hat in hand, a traveler bound for Savannah who had been caught in the heavy fog that blanketed the countryside. He paused at the gates of the Marlowe plantation, glancing up at the towering house with cautious curiosity. The oaks bowed overhead, their branches twisted into arching shadows that guided him forward. Elias was waiting at the door, his posture welcoming, his smile practiced and warm. "Good morning, sir," he greeted, his voice smooth as honey. "You look tired from the road. Won't you come inside and rest a while?" The traveler hesitated, glancing back toward the empty road, but the fog behind him thickened, cloaking the path in white. The house loomed ahead, its windows aglow, promising warmth and comfort. With a grateful nod, the man stepped forward. "If it isn't too much trouble." "Not at all," Elias replied, ushering him across the threshold. "It would be our pleasure." Eugenia greeted him with a curtsy, her smile serene, while Elias carried away the man's pack with youthful eagerness. Margaret lingered in the corner, her eyes fixed on the stranger with quiet despair, as though she were watching the beginning of a play she had seen too many times before. She caught his gaze for an instant, her lips parting as if to speak, but she said nothing. The heavy door closed behind him with a sound like finality. That evening, in the tavern at Willow Creek, the townsfolk whispered again of the Marlowe family. Another traveler had gone up to the plantation. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads. None would dare speak of going after him. And so Thomas Ellery's name joined the unspoken litany of the lost. He became another shadow in the town's dark legend, another soul consumed by the house on the hill, a house that never died, a house that always fed, and a house that would forever welcome its next guest with open arms. The Marlowe home breathed on.